Today I want to share with you my favorite acrylic painting tools that you don't necessarily have to buy at the art supply stores. You might even have them around the house, but they're very useful when painting with acrylics. And as I'm showing you the tools, I want to show you examples of how I use them in artworks that I created. Some are a little bit boring, but very useful, so stick with me. And some are more interesting and like give a pop to the artwork, so stick till the end, and I hope it gives you a lot of inspiration. First, let's start with something super boring that is very useful. Saran wrap. Plastic film is very useful in many situations. Sometimes in a painting, I don't know where to go. I'm not sure what color I should put where, whether it's a background or a specific pop of color in a painting. And I use cling film, of course, on a dry canvas. I wait for my painting to dry. I cover my dry canvas with a piece of cling film in the area that I want to test, and I test the different colors, different options that I want to try out and see if it works with the composition. It really helped me and saved me time countless times. You're probably gonna tell me that I could do that in Photoshop. Of course, sometimes I do. Sometimes I take a photo of a work in progress, pop that picture in Photoshop and try a few things in there. But I don't have Procreate where I can easily have a pen to paint, so I have a mouse. I'm not fully equipped there. So sometimes I find it a lot easier to use cling film, especially when it's something in a specific area that might be a little bit more intricate. I find that it's faster that way, since I'm already in the studio with my paints and all that. So it helped me in many situations. It's also very useful to keep my paint palette wet all day long. I made a video about paint palettes, how to keep a paint palette wet. You can cover your paint palette with cling film for 24 hours easily to keep your acrylic paint wet. Something a little bit more interesting, to sketch my initial sketch on my canvas before painting, I like to use pastel crayons, pastel pencils. I usually take neutral colors, but the fact that they're powdery and pastel-y, it's really easy to wipe away if you make a mistake with a little bit of water, a wet rag, to erase it that way as opposed to using a regular pencil and an eraser. Pastel pencils are my favorite to sketch. Another item that is very boring but very useful is baby wipes. I use baby wipes in many situations to wash my fingers, of course, to clean around my area, but not only that, as a beginner you might not know this, but it's very easy to erase a section of a painting if ever you made a mistake or you don't like what you've done with a wet rag. You just take the section off before it dries and you can rework it instead of waiting for it to dry and paint over it. Sometimes it's very useful to try out a section real quick, knowing that you can wipe it away if ever you're not sure. So I use baby wipes for that. You can also use a wet rag, paper towels. You can also use a sponge. And the benefit of a sponge is also that it can create nice textures because you can paint with a sponge. Any type of wet sponge or rag can be used to wipe away sections of a painting and also to create a nice texture by blending things around with a rag or a sponge. It gives another type of feel than with a paintbrush. In the same vein of creating texture, I like using a mister like this, spraying some sections of a painting to create intentional water droplets and blot them with a little bit of a paper towel. Creates really interesting patterns. That technique is known as lifting. You're lifting paint, so it could be used to create snow on, let's say, a blue background. You can get that effect of snow, stars, a whole bunch of different things, and using a whole bunch of water and letting it drip. I made a whole video about dripping, and it's a technique that is often used, can also create a very interesting texture in a painting. It's also very useful to mist your paint palette to prevent it from drying. As a beginner, I never thought of using a mister to create texture on the canvas, so that's why I'm mentioning it in case you haven't thought about it. It's very useful. More on texture, I like spatters. Sometimes very fine misty spatters, sometimes big blobs of like linear spatters. And there's two tools that I like to use to create them. For the more pointed areas and a more subtle misty spatter, I like to use an old toothbrush. You need a more diluted paint for this, but it creates a really nice fine mist of paint and spatter on the canvas. And this tool, it's made by Liquitex. It's a freestyle flat spatter brush, I guess. It's so much fun to use and it creates very bold spatters. You can flick paint like this or you can flick it like this on the canvas. And let me tell you, it spatters. It really works. Another way to create texture on your canvas, a lot of it is in abstract work, I guess, but it can be used in many situations, is to use shapers. There's a whole bunch of types of shapers. Some are rubbery, there's like a straight line, some have a specific texture that you can really go in and dig into a thick layer of paint to create a unique texture. Some shapers like this have a rubbery tip and you can kind of dig into your painting to create line patterns. You can also do that with a really old stiff brush. Like this brush is so stiff, it's almost like a pencil, and it's fun to dig into the paint as well to create erratic lines or texture. Another way I like to create texture in abstract work is to use a steel brush like this. I got this at a hardware store and I've used it many times to create a rough texture in my paint. Paintbrushes, there's a few things I want to mention about paintbrushes. I'm not going to go too much into specifics, but one type of paintbrush that I like to use is a very bristly old paintbrush that will allow me to give a rougher texture on my canvas in certain areas. It's good for foliage, tall grass. Whenever you want to see a real bristle mark on the canvas, those old rough brushes are useful, so don't throw them out. I like to keep mine. The second type of brushes that I want to talk about are oversized brushes, really large brushes. I've underestimated large brushes for a really long time because they're so expensive, but they're very useful. Depending on your style of painting, they could be useful to create skies that are very blended and not feel overworked, because sometimes when using a paintbrush that is a little too small for the area you're working with, you can see all the small intricate paint brush strokes. Maybe that's what you want, depending on what you want. But if you want a very blended kind of feeling, an airy feeling of blended colors, you need to work with a large brush. Skies, water, lakes, to create that feel of water and like the fluidity effect, you create it with a large brush. Two more boring tools that are very useful. One is a pair of tweezers. I'm using old tweezers that I keep in the studio just for painting. Have you ever painted a really nice background, super nicely blended, and bristles come off the brush and get stuck on your canvas? Happens a lot. The second boring tool that is so useful is this. To save money and squeeze every last drop of paint in a tube, this is very useful. It took me way too long to buy this, but I haven't regretted it. It was annoying to buy because you don't want to spend money on things that are not exciting, but it's very useful. I'm glad about it. One more boring thing, and then there's gonna be a few more things that are more exciting, I promise you. By the way, if you like the paintings that you saw along the way, subscribe and hit the bell. I make videos every week, usually Saturday morning. A lot of it is cozy art vlogs where you see me in the studio, see my whole process. And I paint abstract art, sometimes more figurative art. It's kind of like a mix of everything. So subscribe, hit the bell, like the video. Thank you so much in advance. All right, the other thing that I like to play with is paint swatches. Paint swatches you get at the hardware store. I like to just play around with colors, see what works together, like find inspiration, come up with a new color story, new colors that I've never really worked with. Sometimes when you're in a rut, it's fun to play with that and discover new combinations that your brain might not naturally go to. I don't know about you, but I tend to often go to the same types of colors and not break out of it. Naturally, that's where I go, but sometimes I feel like being inspired and trying new things. So that's where I go and I kind of randomly pick things and then I adjust, and it gives me a point of inspiration, but also it prevents me from trying things with real paint and kind of wasting paint and not knowing where I'm going with paint. That's a nice first step. It's very underrated, I find, but it's so useful. The good stuff. If you're looking for a little bit of excitement in your paintings, but you don't know what, you're in a rut and you want a little bit more inspiration, sometimes it's fun to add a little bit of like a pop. One way I do that is to add a different medium at the final stage of a painting, and my favorite to add is oil pastels. I wait for my acrylic painting to be completely dried, and then I add a bit of texture in specific areas to create a pop and some kind of interest. And oil pastel is a very specific type of material that gives a unique texture that I really like. I like it for line work. I use it in a very expressive way as opposed to trying to render something more realistically. That's how I like to use it. Oil pastels comes in little tiny sticks, and it comes also in giant sticks, and they're really fun to play around with. In the same vein, there's also oil paint sticks. I've used them a few times before. Same kind of principle. When the acrylic paint is fully dried, I could use the oil paint sticks on top to create that texture. It's very similar to oil pastel. The difference though is that oil pastel is kind of movable, so you have to wait a couple of weeks for it to dry and harden, and then you could use a spray varnish on top of it to seal it. Whereas oil sticks don't need it. They dry by themselves and they'll stay put on the canvas. Whatever you prefer. Another thing that I really like to use is crackling medium. I've had a lot of fun playing around with it in abstract work. It's just a gel that you put on top of your paint when you're done with it, and it's going to make that layer of paint crack. And the thicker you go with the gel, the bigger the cracks, and if you go really thin, the crackling medium will give smaller cells and smaller scaling effect. It can be used in pure abstract, but you could also use it in a section of a landscape, let's say. That's something I want to try. I haven't tried it yet. Another way to give a little pop in a painting is to use metallic paints. I feel like they're not very much used that often. It could get very bold and very too much really fast. So that's why I like to use it as an accent as opposed to using it in a big area. I did a few florals, like expressive florals, and at the end of the painting, I added a little bit of gold, which I find very interesting. Of course, the metallics could be used in portraits for specific areas of a skin tone. It could be interesting, or any number of things. One tip with metallics is that you could use silver metallic paint and add that silver to any regular color to give, let's say, a red a metallic sheen. Haven't tried it, but I do want to try it. If you want to see me in action, go watch this vlog. Hopefully it'll give you some inspiration. I will see you in just a few days for another one. Thanks for watching. Bye.